It indeed is an honor to be present here today at the Mint Mobility Conclave. A warm welcome to all the attendees present here today. And mobility today is the buzzword. Mobility is what we as human beings get excited about. It enables us to transact. It enables us to interact. It enables us to further our dreams. And mobility across the world transcends all three scapes: the landscape, the railscape, and the airscape, in addition to the seascape. So today, in my present capacity, I'd like to talk to you about the airscape in India. Mobility, as far as aviation is concerned in India, is an idea whose time has come. Though it was a sector in its infancy in earlier decades, we are now going through a very major growth phase in civil aviation in India. The very fact that we have 144 million travelers in India in pre-COVID years, 1920 to be exact, and if you compare that to our closest competitor, which is the railway sector, and because of the fact that airplanes are air conditioned, when you look at second class AC and first class AC sector within the railways, which is a portion of the railway traffic, that railway traffic is about 185 million people. So therefore, yes, civil aviation still lags the railways, sector to sector on comparison basis. But if you look at the compounded annual growth rates of both these sectors, within the second class and first class AC sector of the railways, you're looking at a CAGR of roughly 5.3%. But when you look at the civil aviation CAGR over the last 6 to 7 years, you're looking at a CAGR of 10.6%. And therefore, a time will come in our country where civil aviation shall become the mode of mass transport for most of our citizens. Now, when we move from intermodal transport to intramodal transport within the civil aviation sector is also a very interesting phenomena that is developing. And that interesting phenomena is that whereas tier 1 city transport within civil aviation was growing roughly at about 5.6 to 5.8%, whereas tier 2, tier 3 transport in that sector was growing at between 10.2 to 10.5%. In the last 3 years, that growth rate of tier 2, tier 3 sector cities has been growing at 31%. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the mainstay of the civil aviation sector, which used to be I to D, international to domestic, or tier 1 to tier 1 city transport within the country, i.e. Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, Bangalore, that growth is now really being powered from tier 2, tier 3 cities from a delta point of view, a growth rate point of view. So when you put this matrix together, and if you look at the growth in fleet size in India as well, from a fleet of 410 aircraft in 2013-14, we are roughly somewhere around 690 aircraft today. And that combined with the fact that there is a great focus on fleet acquisition. And I am looking at a growth rate of airplanes in the fleet by roughly 10 to 15% per year, growing to almost 1,200 aircraft in the next 4 to 5 years. That positions India in a very sweet spot in terms of domestic transport as well as international transport. Now, mind you, we are coming out of a very, very tough period of COVID, where probably no other sector in the world has been hit as hard as the civil aviation sector. A sector that has literally hemorrhaged $370 billion worth of losses globally, and close to about $2.9 billion worth of losses domestically. But still, our airlines, our airports, all members of our ecosystem are striving hard, working hard to make sure they provide that service capability across the length and breadth of our country. So I think it's important in that perspective to look at what is going to be the growth drivers in the years and the days to come. So first of all, our key imperative was really opening up capacity. And we opened up domestic capacity to 100% by October 2021. And we opened up the international capacity to 100% by March of this year. And that allowed a re-emergence of this sector in the transportation wavelength of India. Along with that, I think it was extremely important to really look at last mile connectivity. And therefore, what's important is not necessarily only wide-bodied aircraft bringing passengers from abroad to India, or comparatively the larger narrow-bodied aircraft such as the 737 and the A320 running between metros and smaller cities, but also the Tier 3 city connectivity with ATRs, with Q400s, and also the last mile connectivity through smaller aircrafts, sub 20-seater aircrafts, through helicopters. So take the example of helicopters. We have probably the lowest per capita penetration of helicopters in the world in India. We only have 250 helicopters in our country for a country of 1.3 billion people. There are countries like Brazil, like America, that have between 4,000 to 6,000 helicopters on a much lower population base. And therefore, we brought out the Heli-Seva scheme, which would really look at ensuring that we increase the penetration of helicopters in our country by lowering all TNFC charges, TNLC charges, RNFC charges, by making sure that we put together a Heli-Seva portal so that you get clearance for flights rapidly and you do not have to wait for a long period of time, by setting up heliports in all corners of the country, by making sure hilly regions and especially the northeastern states get greater connectivity not only through helicopters but through small aircraft. For example, we bought the Indian-made Dornier 228, the Hindustan 228 from Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. Alliance Air bought that aircraft, and we are now flying it between Lilabari and Pasighat, Tezu, all the advanced landing grounds in Arunachal Pradesh. So that last mile connectivity all the way up to the border is today something, an area where we are trying to forge ahead. So along with that preponderance on last mile connectivity, I think it's also important to ensure the viability of the industry. And as I mentioned to you, that this is an industry that has been through a very, very difficult time for the last 2 years. And therefore, the first thing I did was set up 8 advisory groups, because I believe that our job in government is not to be one of a regulator, but to be one of a constructive collaborator. And therefore, these 8 advisory groups have been set up by me, which look at each one of the ecosystems within civil aviation. So we look at airlines, we look at airports, we look at MROs, we look at cargo, we look at drones, we look at flying training organizations, we look at even research and academia. And I chair these groups myself, and it's really a thinking board ideology to be able to bring ideas and problems to the table, which then need to get resolved before our next meeting. So that's the way we are trying to constructively work. In one of these meetings, one of the issues that we discussed was the high rate of VAT on ATF. Soon after taking over in August, September of last year, I wrote to 22 chief ministers to lower the VAT on ATF, followed that up with video conference calls, multiple sessions with the state governments, pleaded with them to ensure that we lower VAT and increase connectivity to those states. And through this conclave, I would like to thank the chief ministers of 16 states in India. Prior to taking over, we had 12 states in India that charged VAT between 1 to 4% on ATF, and we had close to about 26 states in India and union territories that charged VAT on ATF close to about 20 to 30%, which is a huge amount. Today, I'm glad to report to you through this conclave that formula has completely changed. Today, 16 states have come on board and moved towards the 1 to 4% regime on VAT, which means that today 28 states, up from the 12 initially, are charging VAT in the lower regime of 1 to 4%, and we have only 8 states left that are within the 25% to 30% bracket of VAT on ATF. I'm still working with those 8 states and imploring them to come on board. What this does is two things. As we have seen in the example of Kerala and Andhra Pradesh, the minute that they lowered VAT in those 2 states on ATF, within 3 months, we had an increase of close to about 15 to 20% in average aircraft movements per week in terms of flight connectivity to those 2 states. That is on the one side. On the other side, what happens with lowering VAT on ATF is that there is a greater impetus for airlines then to refuel in your state. So take the example of the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. The minute that the Lieutenant Governor lowered the VAT on ATF, within 3 weeks, there was a 360% rise in refueling happening in J&K. So the twin benefits, one of greater connectivity, the second of greater refueling, both come into play the minute the tax levels of VAT on ATF fall. We also provided international connectivity from Srinagar, all again because of the fact that VAT was lowered on ATF. So along with working with stakeholders to make sure that we resolve their concerns, I think it's also important now in India to look at the whole of aviation approach. Too much preponderance has always traditionally been on airlines and airports, and rightfully so, because they are the linchpins of the ecosystem of civil aviation. But now that these linchpins or these bulwarks have come into place in a very formidable manner in our country, it's important also now, very much like the auto sector, to set in place the ecosystem of civil aviation. And that ecosystem comprises of multiple myriad areas within civil aviation. So whether you talk about cargo, whether you talk about drones, whether you talk about flying training organizations, whether we talk about ground handling, across the board. So let me talk about a few of these areas. First is air cargo. Well, in the time of COVID, where everything seemed to be shut down, this was the one silver lining for the civil aviation sector. And it is in this period of COVID that we have garnered from a measly 2% of international cargo traffic to almost 19% of international cargo traffic today. Many of our airlines also move towards cargo, and which is why from a figure of close to about 24 lakh tons in 13-14, we have reached a figure of close to about 31 lakh metric tons of material being transported by air cargo. But I think this is a sunrise sector in India. It needs to grow tremendously, and I'm glad to report to you that we've seen a new player after many, many years entering the cargo sector in the last couple of weeks. So along with cargo, I think it's also important to look at transporting perishables through cargo, and for that we've put in place a scheme called Krishi Udan. And through Krishi Udan, we are transporting perishables from the northeast of India to all across the globe. Assamese lemons, lychees, across the board, the king chilies are being sent to Germany, to London, across the board to the Far East. And along with that, we have been able to ensure growth from a figure of 84,000 metric tons last year to almost about 110,000 metric tons of perishables alone in this year. So a growth factor of almost 30% in that area. And the reason that's happened is that we have moved from Krishi Udan 1.0, which was launched early in 2021, to Krishi Udan 2.0, where we have seen a convergence happen across 8 ministries, all the way from Department of the Northeast to the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Fisheries, the Ministry of Civil Aviation, all coming together to give a greater impetus to Krishi Udan as we go forward. The third area is the area of flying training organizations, because as you expand your civil aviation infrastructure, you also need the human resource to back it. We have a figure of roughly about 1,000 pilots that we need to train per year. We have 34 FTOs in place in India. By the end of December 2023, we will have an additional 15 FTOs in place, so that number will go close to 50, 6 in the next year and 9 in this year being set up in various parts of the country. The other exciting area is the area of drones, which I believe will give a huge opportunity within India for value creation, both in the services sector and in the manufacturing sector. With the establishment of the new drone policy, along with the PLI scheme for drones, as well as the fact that the government is providing the demand creation, we are looking at a great growth in this sector as well. MROs is another important area in India because the support systems have to be put in place. And I'm glad to report to you that 85% of India's MRO service, which today is being imported, with the new announcement by Safran to put in place a $150 million facility in India, employing 1,000 people, we're going to have close to about 1,000 engines being serviced from India. So all in all, this sector is poised for growth. This sector is poised to attain new heights. And I'm very confident that in the days to come, civil aviation will become the mainstay of transportation in India. With these words, I thank you for having me and wish you all the very best in this mobility conclave of the Mint. Thank you very much.